This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Papier Plume Bayou Nightfall. I'll be testing it in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at a writing sample that I did previously on 20-pound copy paper. Then I'll take a look at some inks from my collection that are comparable to Bayou Nightfall. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Papier Plume Bayou Nightfall came off the nib of my glass dip pen quickly at first, and then you can see it got a little bit drier where I had less ink toward the end of the writing sample. It felt a little bit dry as I wrote. The swatch that I did with my tweezers was nice and crisp. The ink did a good job of grabbing the paper and holding on to it. You can see there's potential for some nice shading as the ink ranges from a dark medium to a very light. The drip of ink at the end of the ink swatch made a little halo of darker ink, but there's no sheen to be seen. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has a stainless steel extra fine nib. In this extra fine nib, I have to say it just wasn't that pleasant. Part of the problem is the ink comes across as very faint. The legibility to me is not that great, and so I have the feeling that I'm subconsciously that I'm needing to press a little harder, so it comes across as kind of scratchy, but I think it's just because I'm pressing onto the paper too hard. So when I write with a lighter hand, I still get the same looking line. So I'm going to put that it's okay. It wasn't really scratchy unless you just tend to write with too heavy of a hand. Next, I've got my Pilot Legno. It has a 14 karat fine nib. Moving up to this gold fine nib, you can see that it writes much wetter, therefore the line is a little bit wider. You've got more of a cushion of ink. You can write with a lighter hand and you've got a much better legibility, and it was very smooth, very pleasant, and I just enjoy looking at it also. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 74. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Again, this is very smooth, but I'm glad I chose these two nibs to demonstrate this, because I'm seeing a situation that I find a lot of times. You get a lot of the very pale tones. Instead of having an ombre shading on each letter, you get some pale letters and some darker letters. This was very smooth, but the legibility of it is not as good as the fine nib. The shading is much more uniform, and the legibility is much better in the finer nib than I'm seeing in the medium nib. Next, I've got a Jinhao X750, and I've installed a Nemesign 0.6 stub nib on it. In the past, I used this 0.6 stub nib for nearly all of my writing samples or ink tests, and I've gotten away from it, and I just recently decided to give it another try, especially with this ink that has some nice shading to it. Again, it's a little bit too pale on this Tomoe River paper, but I've done some writing samples on other papers that are a little more absorbent, like Rhodia, and I really enjoyed this nib. So this is, let me see, this is very smooth. For this paper, it might be a little too smooth though. I need to interrupt my original video to mention that I enjoyed using Bayou Nightfall in this Jinhao X750 with the Nimacine 0.6 stub nib. I enjoyed it so much that after filming, I inked up a converter with Bayou Nightfall, and when I went to do a writing sample, it was writing very dry, and then it burped a bunch of ink out, and I was reminded of why I stopped using this pen and nib combination for ink tests. The results I was getting from my dip tests did not match the writing experience I was getting when I inked up a converter. All these other pens and nibs that I use in my writing samples, whatever results I get in my dip tests, usually match the writing experience that I get when I go back and ink up a converter and use it for just regular writing. So I just wanted to mention that in this video. Next, I've got my Pilot Pluminix. It has a stainless steel cursive medium nib. This was unpleasant. It just felt dry, and well, it wasn't as dry as I thought it was going to be. The little 0.6 stub nib looks like it was even drier. This was nice and smooth, and I could tolerate it, but this cursive medium nib just felt too dry on the page and was unpleasant, so I'm going to put dry on that. Next, I've got my Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This was nice and velvety smooth. You're seeing quite a bit of shading here, and I want to show the reverse writing in this. This ink is a little bit too pale for reverse writing, at least for me. Maybe just on this paper with it being such a smooth paper. This Kaweco broad nib is an excellent reverse writer in most circumstances. And finally, I've got another Jinhao X750. This one has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. This was nice, and this one was glassy smooth, just very slippery. The Kaweco was more of a velvety smoothness. It had just the tiniest bit of feedback that would keep you from slipping and sliding around on the page. While this dries, I'm going to take a look at the writing sample done on 20-pound copy paper. The writing sample that I did with the 1.5 stub and the Kaweco broad nib, I'm not seeing much feathering. The letters are just the slightest bit ragged, like where you've gotten some spread, but it was actually pretty pleasant to write with. I did some reverse writing with that Kaweco broad. It was very nice on. You can see I put nice exclamation point. It was very nice on this copy paper. The Pluminix was also pretty nice. Surprisingly, I didn't like it on the Tomoe River, but nice on this copy paper. That Nimacine stub nib was nice and smooth. The Custom 74 was nice and smooth, and it didn't feel too wet. The leg no was just okay. I noticed that it felt like the inside of the nib slit was catching on the page. And I noticed when I got done writing, it had picked up some paper fibers. So the two fine nibs weren't pleasant to write with, and which this is a somewhat pale colored ink, so it's not the best for extremely fine nibs anyway, but my medium nibs up were really nice. And the bleed through wasn't very bad either. I'm going to take a look at the water resistance test next before I take a look at comparable ink samples, because I just want to show this ink was surprisingly very water resistant. There's a lot of gray in this ink, and the description on Van Ness described this as a blue-black that has some green undertones. And it's a weird ink. When you look at it, it's hard to place what it is. You can tell there's a whole lot of gray in there, but is it blue? Is it green? And it's a little bit of both, but it's mostly gray. When I first started writing with Papier Plume Bayou Nightfall, I thought this is probably going to be very similar to J. Urban Vert de Gris. So that's the first ink that I pulled. And they're not that similar. Yeah, they're both inks that have some gray to them, but the Vert de Gris has a lot more color to it, where the Bayou Nightfall has more of the gray to it. So I had just gotten a bottle of Vert de Gris, and I was thinking, oh, I won't need a bottle of Bayou Nightfall. But Bayou Nightfall is enough different that I think it would be okay to have both in your collection, especially since Bayou Nightfall is so water resistant and Vert de Gris is not water resistant at all. So I started pulling several of the lighter gray inks, the gray inks that tend to shade to compare, and Kirisame is a warmer gray. It's got more of a beige tone to it. Mont Blanc Oyster Gray is kind of similar, but it's more gray. It doesn't have that color to it. Again, Pelikan Edelstein Moonstone is more of a true gray. It doesn't have much color to it. Robert Auster's Summer Storm is a gray ink that I always think of as having a lot of color to it. It has a lot of purple to it. Sometimes, depending on what inks you compare it to, it looks more blue, but compared to Bayou Nightfall, it looks very purple. Noodler's Lexington Gray is just more of a true gray, and I find that all the previous inks tend to behave more like Bayou Nightfall. They have that shading to it. Lexington Gray tends to be a little flatter in my experience in the pens that I've used it in. Graf von Faber-Castell Stone Gray. Now we're getting to an ink that has more complexity to it, like this ink. And Diamine Earl Grey is another gray ink that has some complexity to it, but it doesn't come out as much in most of the pens that I use it in because it's so dark. Bayou Nightfall, you see more of the color in the pens that I use it in. Okay, on my 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, we didn't have any areas that wanted to bleed through. This is a lighter ink, so I'm not seeing as much show through. There's not any sheen to this ink, and it looks kind of grainy when you use it in the wider nibs. You see a little bit of that graininess. But you also see in the darker sections, you see that halo of dark ink that looks kind of neat. This is an interesting ink, and someone mentioned in a comment in a recent video that shading to them is not a desirable quality. They've been using fountain pens for years and years, and shading was something that you would see when the ink was not a good ink or a pen was not performing properly. And when I first started using fountain pens, I did not like shading at all. And it was the type of pens and inks that I was using. I liked fine pilot nibs, steel pilot nibs, and the inks that I was using, if I would get any shading, it just looked sickly and not good. But I found as I've tried lots of different inks, some inks shading just comes across looking beautiful. Now, even in a ink that the shading looks good with some nibs, in some of the nibs, the shading doesn't look good. So it's a matter of personal preference. I find for me, dark blue blacks, I do not like shading at all. In fact, Lamy Blue Black was one of those inks that I was using in a Lamy steel nib, and it just looked horrible. And so I thought for a long time that I did not like blue blacks. And when I got my Lamy Gold nib, for some reason, I tried that Lamy Blue Black in it, and I loved it because there was no shading. That gold nib wrote really wet, and it's an extra fine nib, and it was just a solid, really fine, solid, uniform line, and I loved it. So it's one of those things that some inks I like shading, some inks I don't. Some pens I like to see shading, and some I don't. That's the fun of trying all these different ink samples. Well, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.